my name's Taylor. I'm on the Snaptrude product team. I kind of do a little bit of everything over on the Snaptrude side. Um, I'll be going through just like a high-level overview of what Snaptrude is and what you can do with it. But before, my background is in architecture. I practiced for 6 years up in Seattle at Perkins and Will. Ultimately, architecture tech had more pull on me, so I joined a couple of tech startups, and now I'm over at Snaptrude, essentially helping to build tools for architects and share them in forums like this. So with that, I'll try and spend probably just like a quick 5 minutes just giving like a quick overview of the app, what you can do in the app and sort of what are the primary areas to do your work. I always like to break this down, and it's nice within the interface. This is a finished model. We'll work from a new model and sort of step through sequentially, but it's always nice to see something finished when you're getting an overview. But Snaptrude itself, once you actually open it up, is going to have 4 different modes. So what we're looking at right now is the design mode. This mode is going to be, it's going to feel very similar to SketchUp or Rhino in terms of, its capabilities. You can start to push and pull objects and start to modify things as well. So it's going to be where you're going to do all of the manual modeling and actual designing of the project here. One thing you'll notice is that when we select any of these spaces, and my Zoom wants to block this. When I select any of these spaces, I can actually go ahead and I can get an areas breakdown on this right side. You can break that down by net or gross or even down to FAR. In this case, I always like to describe this side panel as sort of your design data sidekick, where it helps inform you as you design, because as you're adding spaces to the canvas, you'll see these metrics updating live. But this is just a smaller reflection of what's actually happening on the back end when it comes to the actual programmatic data that is associated with all our spaces. And so that's going to lead us over to our program mode. So program mode is the simplest way to think about it is it's an Excel spreadsheet that's just directly tied to your 3D model. So any work that you do in the model, as far as adding different spaces and object types, is going to appear in this spreadsheet. And in a sort of two-way connection, any spaces that we add as a new line item will also populate in our design canvas as separate blocks for us to start working with. So the idea with this is that, as you're kicking off projects, you'll have the ability to work side by side with a target program, or if you're building that program up as you go for a client, being able to have access to that data on hand and be able to present it and know that it's accurate representation of the model. I'll probably leave that there just because we'll get into some of that with the agents as well. The next mode is going to be BIM mode. This one is a quicker touch point, but the best way to think about BIM mode within Snaptrude is it really represents the ability to take your model to the next level of detail in terms of both Snaptrude capability and actual visualization, but as well as interoperability. So one of the biggest things we have within our BIM mode is called Sketch to BIM here. Sketch to BIM is going to give you the opportunity to essentially pre-map Revit families onto this mass, and then we can start to translate this into Revit objects. So on this right side, you'll see here, we have glass curtain wall. If you have, firm standard libraries, you can also upload those on the back end, so you can start to pre-assign these. And what this will do is essentially convert this entire model into a native BIM element that can then be transferred over. So we could run this really quick just to see what that output looks like. And then the final mode that we have is going to be present mode. And I'll just let this run just really quick. So you can see what it's doing. It's basically just converting all these space objects directly into BIM elements for us. So really helpful when it comes to interoperability and being able to go into Revit without having to, trace over a mass that's imported from Rhino or SketchUp or remodel the whole thing. And then the final one is going to be present mode. So present mode, you can start to think of this as, if you guys use Moreau or Figma or anything like that, it's essentially that for architecture teams and AEC teams. So the idea is that you'll be able to have an infinite canvas where you'll be able to start creating presentations and actual outputs from your model and from your project directly in the app. So you'll get a lot of auto-generated outputs like this, and we can dig into some of that with some of the agents. But you also have the ability to start creating really polished presentations that have project data, and we'll probably finish off today with just some of the AI rendering capabilities on the back end. But all this is essentially the place where you'll go to be able to just communicate the design intent, the vision, and the data that's associated with that. Um, so with that, what I'd like to do is basically just jump into, a blank project. And I mentioned sort of the sampling of agents. And we'll start to walk through basically what it looks like to jump through some of these modes, start creating outputs, and actually start using some agents to basically get some work done in the app for us. And so I always like to position this as being able to offload certain tasks to the agents that you want to speed up or that you don't necessarily want to spend a whole bunch of time doing. You can start to automate some of those. So in this example, we have a site here. I've got a site selected up in Seattle. And what I always like to do when I'm kicking off a new project, especially in a jurisdiction like Seattle, where I know zoning is quite chaotic, is start actually working with an agent to do just an initial site analysis. So if you hover down here, you'll see a new tab that we've implemented. We call this, agents in Canvas. And the idea is that we can let users essentially call an agent for specific tasks when they need it, as they need it, throughout any of their modeling process. So in this case, we could go ahead and use the analyze site agent. We can prompt this if we want. So I could say, analyze this site or a commercial office tower. And then I could go ahead and run this. And I've actually already ran this prompt in the back end just so that I can keep things efficient. So we'll let this run and get to the final outputs, and I'll just jump to the essentially finished site analysis. So if I jump over to this model here, we'll open our AI agents tab, and we'll take a look at actually what that site analysis is going to produce for us. So I'll select this, and hopefully, okay, you can see it on the screen pretty well. So what you'll see is it's going to essentially give you 3 deliverables. One of them is going to be like a text-based, we call it like a stream of consciousness or stream of thought, right? If I click this drop down here, it's going to go through, an entire site analysis to understand the location, the climate, topography. I don't want to necessarily just read all this, but the whole idea is that you can start to handle as much of the site analysis as possible, all within just one prompt with this agent. And what this does, especially as you're kicking off a new project or a new study for a specific site, is it kind of helps just bootstrap the knowledge that you go into the project with. So the idea is that, instead of having to go through, your local jurisdiction's, zoning code, you can start to get all those references and all that information just pulled in right here. So you can see, it'll give you the specific references that it's used. So in this case, we use Zoneomics on the back end to pull in our FAR and our actual zoning data. But it's also going to give us a link directly to Seattle municipal code, which is never fun to look at, but important because we always like to be able to go verify the information that we're sharing. So you'll have access to that. And then you'll see the zoning data as well. So it's going to give you the sources for all this. And if there are areas where the agent does need to make assumptions where it's not going to know, it'll actually give a confidence score and it'll say, hey, find this information. This is a low confidence output, right? And that's where us as architects come in and make sure that we're essentially validating the output and the workflow that the agent's giving us. So this becomes a really helpful tool, again, just for like bootstrapping that initial knowledge. So you'll see that, as in the dropdown is your primary site and context. It's also going to give you a nice table here to make it a little bit more digestible. So your overall FAR, height limits, and other zoning information will be shown in this table. I won't get into, the full detail portion here, but that's also going to be accessible within the program tab. And then it's also going to go ahead and it's going to generate some diagrams for us. Initially, it'll create 3 diagrams, and we could probably just take a look at this really quick. It's going to give you like a transit and connectivity map. It'll produce a site analysis, and it'll give us some visuals for that as well. So it looks like I want to take a little bit to load here, but so we can let this generate for a quick second, and I'll jump back over to our design tab. But overall, site analysis, I'm going to jump into the next agent. Are there any questions so far? I know I tend to talk a little bit quick, so cool. So from the site analysis, what I like to do is we've generated this understanding of our zoning. We can actually come in here and we can start to generate a zoning envelope. And again, all of this information you can use, as you need when you need it. So in this case, we have preset workflow that we want to work through. But these agents, you can call them as you need them. So you don't have to do the exact workflow that we're doing. So in this case, I'll select the buildable envelope and we'll say, we'll just actually, we have the zoning analysis and we'll let this run without a specific prompt. If you want to get really specific with your prompts, more detail always helps. But you can also just run it as is if you're just trying to do quick studies. So we can go ahead and run this. And again, I've pre-ran this just knowing that we have a limited amount of time. So we'll jump to our next tab, which is actually going to give us that envelope output here. So what you can see is the actual output of this is going to be provided for us in our chat panel on the sides. We can click on Buildable Envelope over here, and let's go see. So we can see essentially the overall information that it's giving as far as like how it went about building this envelope and what it's used on the back end and as far as like our overall site analysis to build this. In this case, the actual output that it's given us, and I can go ahead and I'll change the visibility so it's a little easier to see. The envelope that it's given us is, essentially acknowledging that within the city and our zoning, there's a 85-foot setback requirement of 15 feet for any podiums. So this is basically just giving us that initial envelope. The one thing, that I will reference about this again is, you're not necessarily stuck to just one output. So in this case, I could grab our push-pull tool and I can modify this and override any of these as I need. So, if an agent gives you something that is close but not quite there, you can take manual control over that as you need to begin working with it. So this is essentially, call it the bounding box for where we might want to go in terms of, building out a massing concept. So from here, once you have this, some of these agents will want to work in sequence. So like our massing agent typically likes to work with a buildable envelope because it'll try its best to essentially contain the massing output within that envelope. So we can go ahead and we can click on Explore Massing here. Again, we could prompt this. So if we know that we're working with like a spec commercial office building for multiple tenants, we could go ahead and prompt that here. Or you can run it as is. So in this case, again, I'll just run this one and then we'll jump ahead to look at, what that massing output looks like. And what I want to hit on too is, there's a workflow here that in my past, I've never really done where it's, you automate something, then you do something, then you automate something, and then you do something. And you have this back and forth with the agents and the ability to fine tune each step as you go. So we'll run this really quick. Again, it'll start running. Normally these take, 1 to 2 minutes to give an output here. So we'll run to the finished output and take a look at what that looks like. So on this side, you can see this one actually is not significantly different because what it's done is basically just said, hey, we're going to do a podium tower configuration, and we're just going to create a massing that fits within this overall envelope. AI as a design tool is, I will say, not going to replace architectural taste. And so this is where a lot of, I think, my favorite interactions with our agents specifically come in, because in a lot of cases and in a jurisdiction like this, I know podium tower configurations are really important to being able to, conform to your local zoning. So in this case, we have podium tower configuration for our massing concept. It doesn't actually look, like something you're going to see in ArcDaily, right? So part of this process actually gives us the ability to fine tune this and start to incorporate program within that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave this mass essentially as a sort of simplified mass, and we're going to go ahead and we'll start generating actual program to fill this. And you'll see that, I'm taking baby steps throughout this entire process, just because with any AI agent, there's always, an element of trust. And a big part of this for developing these tools was giving architects the ability to step in at any incremental moment and be able to correct, outputs that they're given and fine tune them to what they need. So in this case, we could just jump ahead and we could keep going down the line in terms of the agents that we want to use. We could go ahead and use our generate program agent. What this is going to do is basically analyze the entire mass that we've generated here, and it'll create a high-level program. So you can think of this as like a department-level breakdown, not for specific spaces. And the idea here is that we'll go high level and we can progressively get more and more granular as we develop the design concept. So in this case, I could say, create a program for a multi-tenant commercial office tower with ground level retail. So I can run this, and what it'll do is it'll take the prompt into account, and it'll start to give me an output for just high-level targets in terms of distribution for these uses. So I'll run this, and we can take a look, in the next tab as we've been doing, as to see like what this agent produces and how that looks. And again, all this is going to come in baby steps because we want to have the ability to step in at any point in time and modify this. So the output of this, this specifically is you'll see that there's new blocks on the canvas here. These blocks are going to be associated with data that's tied in program mode, and it's going to be just a really high level. You can think of it as like a proportional comparison of the actual programs that we've added. So this is a really high level program for what is going to get detailed later on as we have more tenants and TIs start coming in to fill the space, right? But for now, if we want to make edits to this, again, we can change the overall targets that we want for offices, or we can leave it as is, and we can start to undertake a process to distribute this vertically across all of our stories and start to incorporate it within the design concept. So as I go through here, what I'll do next is I'll jump into our agents tab again, and I'm going to do something called stack program. So what this is going to give us the opportunity to do is basically take the high level targets that we've specified for, we want this much office total in the whole project, and start to distribute that amongst all the floors that we've already identified from our massing concept. So we'll run this, and since we already have floors assigned and we have program, we can just let this output go. And then we can go take a look at what this actual output is going to look like. So we'll jump in, and this will essentially produce a vertical stack diagram that's not yet incorporated into our tower. Again, so much of this is really about the incremental iteration and being able to control what's going to go into the final massing concept, right? So this is kind of the singularity between our massing concept and some of the program that we've been working on. It's helpful to have this, separately, because in this case, we have these program blocks, which obviously don't look like a building, but we want to go through and we want to make sure that, these are assigned to the correct floors in terms of, vertical distributions. If we wanted to come in here and, plan 2, and maybe we want, I know there's topography on the site, maybe we want to move the loading down, 1 level. So we can go ahead and we can fine tune this, right? So on the right panel here, I can click our stories drop down, and I can move this to any story. So this gives me the opportunity again to come in, take a look at what the agents actually produce for us, and start modifying the outputs and changing them and fine tuning them for when we ultimately get this into our design concept. This is typically the part where I also like to start looking at taking this massing and actually making it a little bit more visually interesting to work with and design with, right? And this is, my favorite part of being a designer. So the next step is basically going to involve us adding some visual polish to this design concept, and actually going ahead and then incorporating all the program into it. So what we could do here is, we have our massing concept. I'm going to go ahead and just use some of our modeling tools and subdivide it and create just, a simple mass that looks a little bit more visually interesting than, what we currently have as a podium tower. We'll subdivide this. I'll use just 3 subdivisions here. And I'll go ahead and I'll click apply. And I'm going to use our push-pull tool, and I'll grab one of these edges here. And again, we can start just pushing this in. We can make this a little bit more dynamic with the tower facades. And maybe we want to do something like this. We'll specify a dimension. And then as the last little piece of, a design concept, maybe we want to stagger this. And so there's a little bit of offset within the facade. So we'll say we'll move this around 10 feet this way. And maybe we want to do 10 feet this way. So I'll come in here. I'll turn our opacity up just in terms of our view settings. So we can say, if this is a design concept that we're feeling good from like a massing standpoint, right? We could, manually subdivide all these and program spaces out. That would be really easy for, our office tenant spaces, but for the ground level where we have more program, maybe we want to just, get all this incorporated into one run. So the next feature is actually going to be an agent that will allow us to take this entire vertical stack of program and incorporate it into our design concept. So it's called pack program, and it essentially does just that. It's going to study the adjacencies for any spaces that share a level together, and then propose a layout that is incorporated into the design concept. So We'll go ahead and take a look at what this output looks like. But as it runs, it's going to compute basically adjacencies of spaces on the same level. And it'll also start to create some high-level adjacency diagrams for us to look at. Sammy, am I doing okay on time? Cool. Yeah, no worries. That sounds good. Actually, let me refresh this because I think my internet went out. So you can see the actual output of this is going to be basically all of those program elements that we have, but it's now incorporated directly into our design concept. Now, obviously, on these upper levels where, it's just basically a blank canvas for, the TIs to come in later on. That's, low-hanging fruit. The real challenge comes in, when you start to look at some of the ground level uses, right? So we could go to our first floor plan, and we could start to see, it's giving us an initial layout and an initial methodology for like packing these spaces into the program. So we can come in with any of these and start to modify them, as we need. So in this case, right, we could use it, our push-pull tool and start doing, planning exercises on this to start basically rationalizing the layout that we get and some of the actual outputs that we began working with. So from here, there's a couple of places you can go just depending on, which workflow you want. You can also start to add like a core. So we've got an agent that'll place vertical cores within the envelope. If we were to do that and sort of solidify, our design concept with some cores and do some space planning, you'd end up with something like this, where we've got our design concept here. We've got those spaces packed. If we jump down to our first floor plan, you can see now that we're actually able to take full control over this and start, planning around these cores specifically. Now, the packing has done, a good job of getting us, high-level spaces. But again, it's really easy to grab, our push-pull tool and start modifying things and changing things around. Now, if you start looking at, the upper levels, if we go to, the 22nd floor where we have some typical plans, this is one of our shifting floor plates, right? We can use our design tools. And if we know that, this specific floor is going to have 2 tenants, we can come in and we can start to make those changes, right? So we can split these spaces and I could go ahead and, work around this. As I do this, you'll see, that we have 2 separate tenants here. I could double click in, I could change the label, and I could start to assign, different programmatic uses to these spaces and start to subdivide them. And so I think that this probably gets us to a really good point where, we can start to answer some questions. You could absolutely jump into our present mode. I have some in this model and start generating some of those renderings from this. This is a really powerful feature, but really simple to use. Within this, you'll have access to all of your views, plans, as well as 3D views. And you can select any image. So in this case, we've selected this, generic mass that we've modeled. And we can start to prompt over it. So I've saved a couple prompts here and pre-ran them just so that we can see them. But if you wanted to do like a felt tip pen and watercolor style, we could, render it like that. And this will take just a few seconds to do. Then we could sequentially take this and actually convert it to, a photorealistic rendering and go to something like this. So this lets teams iterate really quickly on the design concepts and just be able to start to communicate the actual vision for the project outside of just a 3D model.